Now, I mentioned early in this section that HTML in your browser does not recognize enter keys and it doesn't recognize spaces other than the first space, right? And I showed you why, and then I showed you the break tag, which allows you to enter, a new line. But I have not yet shown you how to do spaces. Now, just for the sake of being thorough, I can show you a quick way to do a space, which is the code ampersand NBSP, semicolon, right? And you can repeat that over and over, and I'll show you here. Put it a bunch of times, and you'll see now there should be a bunch of spaces between hello and world, except that we put a line break in between. So let's get rid of that line break here, and you'll see now there's a bunch of spaces. And you're probably looking at this going, that's really messy, and I would agree with you. This is not the way to deal with spacing when you're creating a web page. I simply showed this to you for thoroughness. The way that we do spacing is to the use of tables. So how do tables work? And what is a table, right? Well, a table is very similar to a table in Word, right? If you've ever inserted a table into Word, if you want to put a table of, facts and figures or whatever in there, you'd go insert table, and you have rows and columns, and you can merge the columns and insert new rows and delete rows and all kinds of stuff, right? That's the way it works here. And every web page is almost always a series of tables built upon each other. So let's look at some web pages here. We'll go ahead. First, we can look at Google here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a snapshot of this using the snipping tool, so we can kind of look at it. And you'll see in the snipping tool, we can draw over it, right? This is probably, if we were to look at the source code, a table. And within that table, you've got a row here, and that ends the row. And within this row, you've probably got another table, and that table's got multiple columns. And maybe this is a blank column or an extra big column. There's lots of ways you could have formatted that. You've probably got another row here. This is probably a row. This probably has multiple columns or is a table within it with multiple columns. And then down here, this is obviously a table with multiple rows. 1, 2, 3 rows, 4 rows, and so on. So that is the way tables kind of line up. If we go to, we can do another example here. Go ahead and close this up, and we'll go to Gonzaga's website. Might be a little more difficult to look at here, but we can see without having to draw it, right? We probably have, again, one table outlining it all. Probably got a row here, a row here, and a row here. This is a table probably with multiple columns. I'm guessing if I stretch, that'll stretch out, so that column kind of wraps down. This is probably a table with 2 rows and 2 columns, right? Down here, more tables, right? Everything in a web page is lined up with tables. This is probably a table with multiple columns up here, another table above it. So everything in a web page is designed around tables. So how do we design our table? So remember that a table is a series of columns and rows. So typically what we'll do is within HTML, we're going to specify a new row, and then we're going to specify columns. So we'll say, okay, here's a row, and then we'll say add a column, add a column, add a column, new row, add a column, add a column, add a column, new row. And then we might say add a column, but make it a width of 2, and then add a column, and then new row. We might say add a column, and then not add another thing on the row. And if we do that, our table will look kind of messed up, but it will accept it, right? So this is the way you build a table. It's always add a new row, and then add the columns after the row. So let's see how this works in code. We're going to add a table down here within the body, and we're going to try to make a 2x2 table. So we're going to start out and use the table tag. Again, we're not very creative in HTML world. Things are typically called what you would think they would be called. So remember I mentioned we build a table. The first thing we do is specify a new row. That is TR, which stands for table row. And notice it does an end table row tag. So everything between these two will be in the first row of your table. Now, each row needs a column. So we specified a row. Now we need to specify a column. To specify a column, we do a slash, a TD, which I believe is supposed to stand for table data. You can do a table header as well, which would be TH for the top column. But since we're using this to organize our page, we're not going to bother with that. So here's your table row. Here's your first column. And then we'll just put within the column the letter A. And then we'll go ahead and save. And what we'll see, let's go ahead and reveal in File Explorer and then open it, is the letter A. And you may be saying, I don't see a table there. All I see is a letter A. And you can tell it's kind of indented, right? So by default, the table is there, but you don't see the lines. You don't see the borders on your table. So we're going to come up here under Table, just to show how this works. We're going to type in border equals 1, and that will make sure that you can see the border, and then when we reload, you'll see the border. So what my recommendation is when you're building a table, always set your border to 1, even if you don't want to see it. And then when your table's built and it looks the way you want, then set your border back to 0, and that will hide your border. So, your visitors don't have to see it, but it makes it a lot easier to work with if you can see it while you're building it. So in this case, we have a table that's 1 row, 1 column. We wanted to do 2 rows and 2 columns, so let's add another column. Remember, we do row first and then columns. So we did our row, now we did a column. Now we need to do another column. And then we'll put a B in there. So now we should have 1 row with 2 columns. And then if we look at it, you'll see there's 1 row with 2 columns. And if we want to add another row, we come down at the end of that row and type in another row. And remember, you have to do a row first and then a column. You can't really have a row without a column, right? So if we do TD and then C and reload, you'll see what I was talking about, right? You don't have to have all the columns filled out in the row, but it does look kind of funny. You can tell, hey, it's missing a column here. So we'll add our last column, TD, D. So there we go. So how does this work when we're formatting it for a web page? We might do like a full page and then have some text across the top. So we'll kind of highlight that now. So let's build another page so we can see how this works. So we're going to come over here on this section over here, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to go New File, and we're going to call it Table Page.html. It doesn't matter what you call it here, but you have to end with a .html, right? If you don't end with the HTML extension at the end, it's not going to know what type of page it is. So we're going to do that, and here is our table page. You can kind of go back and forth between the two. You can also see them up here, which is handy. So on the table page, the first thing we're going to do, right, put HTML in there, put our header, put our title page, and we'll call it HTML page with a table, and then we'll put in our body tag, and there we go. So that's the basic page. We'll go ahead and reveal in the Explorer, and we'll open table page, and you'll see it's totally a blank page, but again, we can view the source and see HTML page with a table, and we can see that's also in the title. So we have our new page created there. Now let's create our table. So we're going to put within our body, the first thing we're going to do is type in table, and then we'll do border equals 1. And then we're going to say width equals 80%. And then we're going to do end table. And then within there, we're right, here is some text. And of course, before we do that, we should do our table row and our table column. Some of you may have already realized that needed to be done and fixed it on your own, right? So now we have a table with 1 row and 1 column with here some text in the middle. And the width has been set to 80%. So if we reload, let's go ahead and close this because we're doing on the new page, you'll see our table is 80% of the page, and here's some text is within there. So you can see the table is there, and watch, if I shrink the page down, it'll keep that table at 80% of the page. So it's a good way to kind of keep formatting consistent. Now, we probably want that centered, so this is probably no surprise, but the tag to center something is center. And then we'll come down here and we'll end the centering. So I'm going to center the whole table. And if you reload, you'll see the table centered now. And it keeps things sort of nice and clean. We know that our text is always centered. Now, within that table, we might have a couple rows, right? One might be the text and one might be the menu. So what we'll do is we'll do a table row above that table row. And we'll make it one column, and we'll go, here is the menu. And if we look at it, you'll see it's looking a little more like a web page, right? This might be where our menu is, home, about, and so on across the top, right? And then down here is the actual text of our website. So how do we get that menu in? Again, we would put it in as another table. So within that table, we would add another table. And we probably want to set the border to 1 so we can see what we're doing. And then we'll end our table. And within that table, we're going to have one row. And we'll probably have multiple columns. So we'll have like home, and maybe another one that says about us, and another one that says buy our stuff, and another one that says something like contact us, right? And so on. This will look a little more like what a web page looks. So if we come up here and reload, you'll see there's our home, about us, sort of our menu showing up there. Now, our menu we probably want centered, right? So we can come over here, and within that TD, we would simply do a center. So that table that we created within the table will now be centered within that cell. And if we come over here and reload, you'll see that it's centered. And now you're probably being able to recognize this as a web page. And of course, the last thing that we want to do is make it so that this table is not seen, right? Because now everything's organized the way we want. So we can set this border to 0 and set this border to 0. And then refresh our page. And now it's starting to look a little more like a web page. Of course, one thing that's missing, right, is how we might do a link, right? So these are all great. They have home, about us, and buy our stuff, and so on. But how do we make these link together, right? So we're going to tackle that in the next video.